Alright, I've got 17 gigabytes of free space on this thing still, so I must have not wasted too much time talking about organs. Or maybe walking around at night making videos takes up less memory than walking around in the daytime. So I might just go ahead and talk about how I have PTSD from, what's that place called? Jeez. If I got $1 every time I forgot what I was talking about, or said, I could buy St. George a real pipe organ. There we go again. North Hills, that's it. I'm going to talk about how I still have PTSD from North Hills. Alright, so I mentioned before in my first video about kind of my faith journey and how I went from being non-denominational, and before that, Reformed Baptist, and was kind of dragged into this contemporary church. It was not my idea. I never would have gone on my own, but I was a teenager and I still didn't have my own car, so wherever the rest of the family went is where I went. And I'm not trying to talk smack about my parents. They got dragged into that because somebody they knew started going there and really liked it. And so that was it. And like I said before, I think that they rely heavily on emotional manipulation to make people think that's the Holy Spirit moving them, but it's really just emotional manipulation. But I've fooled a lot of people, so I'm not going to point at one person and say you're stupid for falling for that, because a bunch of people fell for that. And and I also don't think I'm some kind of spiritual guru for being skeptical about it the whole time. That was just kind of my, I guess you could say, formation was in that Reformed Baptist church, which at the time in the 80s and 90s did respectable Baptist traditional Baptist worship. Hymns accompanied by an organ. And as I mentioned before, we didn't sing that sappy, sentimental stuff. Like He Walks With Me and talks about how we're friends and stuff. No, we sang like Praise to the Lord the Almighty. And I still really enjoy that hymn and listen to organ solos of it still whenever I'm in the mood to listen to some pipe organ music. Or O Sacred Head, or A Mighty Fortress. We sang stuff like that back then. And I mentioned O Sacred Head. We didn't have Lent in the Reformed Baptist Church, but we still sang O Sacred Head before Easter, in the time that would be Lent if we were observing Lent. And that's another hymn that I remember fondly, definitely appropriate for the penitential season, especially for Passion Week. And I'm passionate about music. I hope that wasn't a bad joke. But speaking about passion in music, I'm very passionate about how I feel about the music at North Hills, and it was absolutely abysmal. I went from A Mighty Fortress and Praise to the Lord the Almighty, and check out this 80s Dodge Ram. Is that not cool or what? Oh man, that is a nice truck. Don't you wish they still made trucks like that? I'd take that over a new Ram any day. So getting back to North Hills, I went from Praise to the Lord the Almighty to Our God reigns, Our God reigns, Our God reigns, and I'm about to become an atheist. And a lot of other songs. I don't know why I remember that song, and when there were a lot of songs, many of which were written in the 70s, with very repetitive choruses like that. And there I go again saying, if I could get $1 every time I said, I could buy St. George a pipe organ. And look, they have purple LEDs on the bell tower at Furman University. So now you know where I'm at. Walking around the lake here. There I go again saying, I need to work on that, don't I? So I can sound all professional and be persuasive and stuff. What was I talking about before I said something about buying St. George pipe organ? North Hills, Our God Reigns, very repetitive, shallow music. Yeah. So I went from praise to the Lord the Almighty to really shallow, repetitive music. People sticking their hands in the air like they were at a rock concert. And that's something I was always really uncomfortable with. And people were always trying to kind of pressure me into doing it. So I mentioned before that people were pressuring me to do things that I was uncomfortable with. And that's one of them. Very memorable thing. One thing that really sticks out in my memory is that, another thing that really bothered me, I guess this is just kind of the list of grievances, like we're doing Festivus or something, and so we're doing the airing of grievances now. Another thing that really bothered me about that place, and it really doesn't deserve to be called a church, the very irreverent, and I would even dare to say blasphemous prayers that they would do there. One thing I heard a lot was people saying daddy to God, like daddy this and this, daddy that, daddy, please make Republicans win and us to get cheap gas and blow up all the Arabs and stuff. I'm paraphrasing the ever-loving crap out of it, but they did say daddy, and they were also very shallow and materialistic, and really don't want this to become a political discussion, so I'm not going to get into that. And I got distracted again. If I got $1 every time I got distracted, I could buy St. George a pipe organ. But yeah, the music was horrible. The prayers were not only irreverent, they were just straight up blasphemous, talking about daddy and stuff. That's not just irreverent. That's just creepy and weird. Like what kind of, that's just creepy. So what's the next thing? I don't remember a prayer that I heard there that I ever thought was reverent. Sometimes I thought and this was not common because, like in the Orthodox Church, we do prostrations, and I remember one or two people prostrating, and I felt like, I might be wrong, but I felt like they were putting on a show, like they were trying to show off how pious they were. I'm really, really skeptical. I was then and am now, continue to be extremely skeptical about the sincerity of evangelical prayers. Of course, they will criticize me for pulling out a book to read a prayer, but their prayers are full of pride and vainglory and irreverence. And that has always been my opinion, especially in North Hills, that just spectacular display of the kind of flaunting of irreverence and blasphemy that I saw there. And you might not like what I'm saying, and I'm sorry if I'm hurting your feelings, but that's what I observed and how I felt about it. I felt like the architecture was needlessly ugly and austere on purpose. Like would it cost much more money to build a building out of the same materials that is shaped roughly like a church, and then, as money provides, and I know money is not a problem there, surround maybe the metal structure with masonry, with bricks and things like that, and get a respectable organ, even even an Allen or a Rogers or something would be a big improvement over that praise band. And I'm not a big fan of digital organs, functioning as a substitute for pipe organs, but any digital organ would be a big improvement over that praise band. So there really isn't a justification for that. All the money they have sunk in electronics that, unlike a pipe organ, will become obsolete in a few years. They've probably got, I wouldn't be surprised if they had a few $1 million in electronics over there. And everything that they bought new when I went there has very likely been replaced. Video standards have changed. Computers are a lot faster than they were 20 years ago. So that means buying a bunch of new equipment. Speakers and amplifiers and things like that either have to get rebuilt or just replaced. And, in the lifespan of a pipe organ, probably 3 to 5 generations of AV equipment will have been in that church. And I think it's almost an abuse of the word church to call that thing a church. So let me get back to it. Another thing that they did at North Hills that bothered me then and still bothers me now. I said I have PTSD about North Hills, and I might not be lying. That might not just be a joke. They did this thing called open services, and it was my absolute least favorite thing. I was dragged there, against my will. And again, I'm not intending to talk smack about my parents or anything, but it took them way too long to realize that wasn't a good church. I think there was a point at which I would just excuse myself and go sit in a car or something when they did these stupid open services. It was just the worst thing ever. And what they would do is they would start their service and, do some of those horrible, highly repetitive, shallow songs. And then they would just have a microphone that anybody who wanted to could come up and start talking. And all of these women would get up there, and I'm not talking about women per se, but it was always a middle-aged woman with a dry mouth sobbing into the microphone about something, and her mouth was so dry I can still hear how sticky it was in the microphone, 20 years later. And it was torture listening to that. And like I said before, no one cared about my problems, but I had to listen to theirs. That's how I felt about it then and how I feel about it now. I don't know if they still do that. I haven't darkened the door of that place in a long time. So, they might have stopped doing that. For their sake, I hope they have. But, boy, those things sure are noisy. Yeah, I'm not going to get much talking done with all that going on in the background. But yeah, open services were horrible. And mix that with the way I was treated there and the dismissiveness, any concerns I had. I was really ready to become an atheist after being force-fed a steady diet of North Hills. I was really close to becoming an atheist. I was to the point of asking God to get out of my life, and just let me live my life. And I would just deal with the consequences later. And I guess I'm glad that didn't happen. Even though my life isn't what I would prefer it to be, it's better than it could be. But So yeah, if you're watching this and you're thinking, should I go to a place like North Hills? I would say no. If you are a person who is kind of on the fence about faith, or you're struggling with your faith, I wouldn't go to any place like that, not just North Hills, anything like that. Of course, there's only one place I would go, and that's the Orthodox Church. So let me put that in, I don't know. I mean, I couldn't in good conscience recommend going to a place that I don't believe in. But I would especially recommend not going to a place like that. Just everything they did. I don't know where they got the idea to do that stuff I was just talking about. Like the open service, that was just horrible. I wouldn't be surprised if there was a manual for how to run a non-denominational church, and I really think it's an abuse to call it a church. I guess it really doesn't deserve to be called a church. Maybe there is a manual for that, because I talk about things like this, and other people at other churches that, as far as I know, don't have anything to do with North Hills, have mentioned similar things. Yeah. I don't know. I think I'm kind of losing track here. And I think I may still be traumatized by the experience I had there. It's still a very unpleasant memory that I have there. I have always been and continue to be very skeptical about whether I think the people there were sincere or are sincere. Because if I was sincere, I wouldn't do those things. If I loved God, I wouldn't make a mockery of him, on a stage, and be following the format of one of those mega churches. Although I don't think North Hills counts as a mega church, but their worship format is kind of similar. Movie screens that come down out of the ceiling, really terrible praise band. People who have no business behind a microphone attempting to sing. And there were one or two singers who were actually good, but there were others who were mediocre at best. And I don't know, I guess I'm just going to go ahead and wrap it up. My experience in North Hills was really horrible. It left me with scars that took years to heal and probably still haven't totally healed. So look at the image in my glasses there. That's recursion. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and cut this off now.